Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back, everyone, on the show. My name is Samara Reaño. I am a technical account manager here at AWS, and welcome you all back to AWS Tech Tales. And today I have Shaz with me. So, Shaz, want to go ahead and reintroduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, Samara. Hi, everyone. I'm Shotak Sharma. I go by Shaz. It's so much easier for everybody, including myself. I'm a principal TAM here at AWS. I mainly support global financial services customers, and I've been here for almost 6 years now.
Oh, wow, that's you're hitting a milestone there.
Yeah, it's coming up real fast. I think it'll be six next month.
You blink and then time passes by. I can't believe I'm hitting actually 5 years this year, so I can totally relate on how fast time goes. Ready for that yellow badge.
Yep.
So welcome back, everyone. As you all know, AWS Tech Tales is a show where we're talk about customer issues, talk about new solutions, and we usually have some guests come in and talk about any new solutions or things that they have noticed or worked with their unique customers. We come in, we troubleshoot issues, and then we also find solutions to some common use cases. Hi, Erie Edits. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us today. As you all noticed, Matt is not here with us, but Shaz is, and we have an exciting show today. As you all know, we have been covering UOps or Unified Operations as part of our series so far. Last week, we covered the tale of the critical event support and then feature AWS Countdown Premium. And for those of you that missed last week's show or want to learn more about that, please feel free to go and check that out in our AWS Tech Tales website. And it's where you will find all the show notes and the summaries of the different episodes that we have covered so far. Hello, Reginaldo. Greetings from Brazil. Thank you for connecting today. Hi, Vergetti. Welcome back. All right, I see a lot of our regulars, and we also have Cesar from Argentina. Hi, welcome. Greetings to Argentina. I love soccer, so big fan. All right, Shaz. So I know that we're very excited today to cover the tale of the assessing app resiliency. I think that resiliency is one of those topics that we are continuously having discussions about as technical account managers or TAMs. I think that for us, it's always we're very purposeful to have these discussions with the customer about high availability and making sure that your workloads are being built, keeping best practices in mind, and then with the purpose of having business continuity. So, with that, I want to kind of ask you if this is something that you find yourself discussing a lot, not just with your customers, or just internally here at AWS.
Every day, right? Like, so I think it's that principle that both our customers and the AWS as a whole is deeply invested in.
Mhm.
We definitely don't want availability to be a concern for our customers' workloads, critical workloads, because all these are business impacting, multi-domain, multi-speciality, and it transcends the impact from one customer to the overall national level itself, right? Like you could have something as a trading system, which is the fundamental fabric of the financial institutions, impacted by one or sort of event, but it's not just limited to that customer itself, right? As I was explaining, it goes beyond. And then I do remember some of the bad days that we've had, the rare bad days where we end up on long, long calls with our customers.
Mhm.
But when there is a larger issue and there are multiple customers across the board, like I think I did a session a while back where I was explaining that how I was supporting my customer, but at that point of time, my wife couldn't open up the garage door outside because that apparently that app was also impacted because of an AWS event,
Oh, wow.
and my kid couldn't play his games on the iPad itself, right? Like, so it's not just that it's we are getting impacted from a professional front, it's also our personal lives that we see our
Mhm.
impact, right? Like, so yeah, so we are deeply invested in ensuring that there is enough resiliency, not in just our AWS services, but also the workloads that our customers are bringing on to AWS and making sure how do they meet their availability and resiliency objectives.
No, 100% agree, especially when you are talking about those new workloads or new projects that you're trying to build, right? Sometimes we're talking about what's already in flight, what it has already been built, and how you can improve those workloads. But I think that what we always talk to our customers about, it's being pretty much in those discussions on when an idea is becoming coming together, and you're trying to decide an application, and you're trying to determine what the different components and how everything is going to communicate with one another. You start asking those questions about how available do you need it to be, what type of businesses it's going to support, and then a lot of more pertinent information to address to make sure that you're building it using the guidance from experts, right? And so I think that today it provides like a good insight into exactly what goes on in those conversations and how much into detail we go into those.
And I think the guidance there is always shift left, to your
Mhm.
point, right? When the idea is being built, ask the fundamental questions. And this is both. I've been on the AWS side, I've lived the customer life as well. And
Mhm.
sometimes we always ask for, oh, I want this available 100% of the time.
Right. Mhm.
But when you talk about availability goals, these are the number of nines, right? Like how many number of nines do you want the availability to be? What are your RPO and RTO objectives?
Mhm.
Those terminologies are taking failures into account by default.
Mhm.
And that's what sometimes when we, as part of support or operations, or even as app owners, we discount that fact, the failure in the
Mhm.
equation. And that's why it's very important to keep revisiting some of the decisions and the assumptions that have been made as part of the design to say, are we truly meeting those objectives? Is there a risk that can be covered? And that's where a proactive partnership between AWS support and the customer on resiliency comes into the frame.
No, 100%. And you touch a good point. It's not a one-time discussion and then never again. It's a continuous engagement to make sure that you continue improving over time. As your goal shifts and you look for new objectives and how to kind of work it in a different way or implement a different service or a workflow within that specific workload, is something that continues being addressed and continues to be revisited. So I think that that's a good point to bring forward, as like we have said it many times. All of these conversations that we have with customers, and even if you're just kind of looking at it from your own, it is not something that you only think about and try to achieve only one time. It's something that you're going to continuously look at over time.
Absolutely.
And so with that, I know that we have covered a lot of UOps so far for this quarter with our viewers, but I kind of want to, just kind of deep dive a little more into UOps from your perspective, how you are working with customers with this new AWS support tier, and how that has like reframed those conversations that you have had about resiliency with those customers.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we're going to cut to my deck.
Okay, I'll bring it up. All right.
Okay, and to the audience, I'm going to stay in this mode. I don't like to go into presentation mode all the times because I miss the chat, I miss the audience reaction, right? So, but feel free to kind of post questions and give us feedback as I go through some of these slides. So, as part of unified operations, and I'm sure, as Zamara said, you have already gone through some of the initial framing of UOps, why this is now the highest support tier that is available as part of AWS support. What are our focus areas? How do we really augment our AWS support team for our customers and their key workloads themselves? But resilience being, as I said, a shared responsibility, and it's needed on both ends from the customer side and AWS side. This was a fundamental challenge that we had to solve for as part of the UOps product itself. How do we partner with our customers to jointly improve on some of the resiliency aspects for their workloads? And I say continuously improve because there are always new edge cases that you will find.
Mm-hmm.
There's always deviation in a workload, right? And as an industry, we have very loosely defined what is a workload. And going by the official definition as part of a well-architected, like workload is any combination of services that provides business value, right? So with as vague as a definition of a workload, we had to figure out a way to partner with the customers to document what the current assumptions are and have them continuously improve on some of the areas discovered. So this conversation could come up as part of the design phase. This conversation could come up as part of the deployment phase. So we really went back to basics in terms of how do we figure out where the workload is, right? And we kind of referred to the existing guidance around AWS resilience lifecycle. And as it says, start here, this is something that you do when you are actually designing the workload. But with unified operations, we were actually having active conversations for existing workloads, but also new workloads. So we had to
Hmm.
figure out which phase do we kind of come in and what kind of capabilities should we build for UOps to make this a reality. So diving deeper into some of these practices, these are some of the things that our customers do on an ongoing basis. And that's where some of these things are part of their SDLC. But we wanted to capture some of this as well and see, okay, where can we partner with the customers? Let's say you're in the operate phase. Can we do operational reviews? Can we help you set up better monitoring? Can we optimize your run books as part of respond and learn? And it's not just the run books for on the customer side, it's also the
Hmm.
run books on the AWS support side. What should we do when we get a particular alarm? How should we escalate on our side? If I know that, okay, there is a specific edge case scenario for a workload, I can help and actually streamline our support response as well, right? But now, if I really shift left and I'm working with you as part of the setting objectives or
Hmm.
design and implement, and you tell me, Shaz, my workload needs to be 5 nines. And then if you're opting for an AWS service which you can't architect around to achieve that availability, it's a risk,
Right.
right? And that's where we're going to highlight that as a concern. And then we're going to jointly test some of those assumptions and see if there is better alternatives or there should be any alternate strategies that should be put in play for your workload, right? So that was the challenge we had, and that's where we came up with the critical workload review, or CWR, as the short form as we call it. Um, but that's part of unified operations, right? So
Right.
we do this right before going live sometimes. Sometimes we do it in the design phase, but it's a continuous exercise similar to the AWS resilience lifecycle flow that I shared, where we work with the customer and provide inputs and then guide them over the holistic improvement of the resiliency posture.
That's great. So I have a question here, Shah. So let's say there is a customer that is onboarding into UOps, right? And they already have their documented critical workloads. This is something that it will be something that it's already in production, and they just need to make sure that they add those applications as part of UOps. What do you think will be the time frame from them kind of kicking up the engagement into actually being able to, let's say, have this conversation with SMEs around what they currently have, and then how they can proactively test it and improve and going forward?
That's an excellent question, right? So if you are in production, we are really between operate and respond and learn phases for the workloads. So you get IDR, which is incident response
Hmm.
capability as part of UOps, which has to be deployed in production during the operate phase. But the signals that we get as part of those engagements go into the respond and learn phase, right? And we share, like, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say a EBS volume is in the critical path for the workload,
Hmm.
and we find that, okay, there was a particular anomaly that was detected, and the customers should account for some of these failures on an ongoing basis, right?
Mhm.
Or choose a different EBS type, which is more durable for their workload as per their business needs. Those are the findings that go into the respond and learn phase and go back to set objectives. So when we are in this situation, that's where we do the CWR baselining, where we try to understand what are the workload commitments
Mhm.
and the objectives, and then test them across their assumptions through some of these capabilities itself.
Mhm. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So, from a CWR perspective, a mental model, it consists of two sections. One is a workload review, and the other is the services review. Services review is something that is done by your domain specialists that come with UOps for your workloads. They're going to dive deep into the AWS services that you're using. They're going to validate how the posture of those services against the six different pillars of well architected. And then the TAMs are actually going to consolidate some of these findings in a workload review where we test some of these assumptions or these findings against the workload itself. So, for example, let's say if we find an anomaly on the services side, we can translate whether that's a availability risk to the customer to the workload itself or not, right?
Mhm.
One particular scenario that I ran into when we were building this was the customer was building a multi-AZ workload, and
Okay.
it included different services, included EC2, including RDS, included serverless architecture. And we, when our service engineers or domain specialists actually dive deep into the services, we found that the RDS instances were actually deployed in single AZ fashion.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the explanation from the customer was like, oh, it's okay, it's single AZ in this region, but our grand plan is to actually fail it over to the other region.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we were like, that doesn't meet the availability requirements that
Uh-huh.
the workload has come up with.
Mhm.
And that's where we brought in RDS specific domain specialists who talked about on how they could configure the RDS instance in a multi-AZ fashion. Um, and even though this example may look very simplistic, but it is a reality. We do find a lot of low-hanging fruit as part of these discussions, and it's a quick and easy way where we can actually meet with the customers and bring these findings, uh, create wider visibility towards it, and then work on mitigating it, and then again testing some of those configurations and deployments. And the one question that you asked me before was like, how long, what is the timeline? In the end, the timeline varies on the complexity
Mhm.
of the workload, but I've seen a recent, like a decent CWR analysis and a discussion in about 2 weeks of the
Okay.
initial discovery call, right? So not a very extended process. We have tried
Mhm.
to make it less painful in terms of overall discussions and planning for our customers. We try to do most of the work internally, and then it's the customer part of the conversation which takes time, which should not take more than a couple of hours, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and that's a good point also that you bring, right? Sometimes as a customer or as an owner of a specific workload, you don't really realize the gaps that might be within that workload itself until you actually do like an exercise or you're reviewing it and have like, extra people in the room kind of thinking about how you build this and how everything connects to one another to kind of showcase some of the gaps that maybe they were not jumping out at you specifically, but it definitely raises a flag to other team members that are specialists in that specific service. Another thing, too, which has been a question that has been raised by my customers as well, it's we know that there is SMEs or subject matter experts that are part of that team that you get with UOps, and sometimes it's often seen as just a person that is just one person team that comes in and kind of have a dedicated discussion with you. But in reality, it's more of a starting point of a group of people that is actually aligned to the different domains rather than just one specific person that addresses all those questions and concerns. So just kind of building that conversation around where which specific services that we're talking about, which specialty is needed, and then having that service team member available to our customers as well.
Exactly. And it's again, you could have 20 services in a workload. we will always try to find the expert that we want, but we'll make sure
Mhm.
there is holistic coverage across the services itself.
Exactly. Yeah, which is something that it's a question that I get a lot. I'm not sure if that's a question that you also get a lot from the different discussions that you have around UOps and SMEs, but it's definitely something that really jumps into the conversations more often than not.
Yeah, and we do scale in the backend for sure, right? I think that's the question I get from the customers, like, how can one domain specialist gonna cover everything, right? So as part of CWR, we have a big fan out in the backend, and we try to make sure that all the components of the workloads are actually covered.
Awesome. Yep. Thank you.
So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to break down the CWR,
Okay.
the process itself, right? So uh, right now it may look like a template, but we'll go towards an actual example, and hope, and that's where we'll kind of figure out how you can actually leverage some of the findings as part of the resilience improvement plan itself. So CWR workload overview is the section where we set the stage. We try to figure out what the availability targets are, what the service level objectives are, what are the RTO and RPO. And it's a good discussion to have for us to understand on what the methodology is. Um, for most of the customers that we worked with, some of these fields are very clear. Like they
Hmm.
definitely want very specific availability numbers, how they want to recover, how they want to fail over. But this is where we run into some interesting conversations, right? The workloads that are active typically have been architected to account for a lot of traffic volume, and they're trying to meet the geolocation specific needs for their customers. Warm standby, pilot light, and backup restore are the DR patterns, which are basically aligned for to be when needed kind of scenario, right? Like,
Okay.
so let's say you run into a failure scenario, and you're like, okay, I want to fail over. That's where some of the three patterns come in, and that's where some of the challenges come in, because to be quite honest, doing a DR exercise once a year is not good enough.
I was just gonna say, I think it also comes into that, right? Sometimes the teams have a backup strategy to fail over. They know that they have a standby, but then at the same time, it's kind of being out of the habit to knowing how to do it or testing more frequently. So wondering what it is, I guess, like what you see in the recommendation being like of how often these should be done to kind of account for an updated run books and making sure that everyone is up to date on their training on their failover strategy.
I'm gonna give an answer which you may not like, Zamara. The answer is as often as possible, uh, because there are so many variables that go into a production workload,
Hmm.
not just from an architectural standpoint. And to be quite honest, architecture is a fundamental requirement to
Hmm.
meet your resiliency and DR objectives. However, it's not the only one. Operational excellence is the key missing item that always comes up in our customer conversations. Um, I'll give you some very basic examples. S- A scenario occurs and somebody that can't find a run book
Hmm.
for 15 minutes. I've been in a scenario where a run book was hosted on a system that also went down as part of the event.
Oh no, that's not good at all.
Exactly. So in the end, it's a muscle memory kind of
Hmm.
a thing. So more you do it, the better you get. But there are very specific KPIs that you can track to ensure that you're moving in the right direction. So I always say to my customers, it's like resiliency is a journey, it's not a goal. And you will always find more things to improve on the more you do this.
No, 100% agree. That's actually a pretty good thing to cover today because it's like what you said. You always kind of have to account for that. And then also, I think one thing to address too is that gap in time, right? Because that also is going back to that objectives of the RPO or RTO that you have set, but you're not accounting for the gap of time that you have of you trying to go back to the run book or not having everyone that should be available to make that decision to fail over, etc. So definitely something to also keep in mind whenever we're talking about this type of reviews.
Exactly. The second item is the architecture and service inventory, what we try to do on our side is to map out what the external upstream dependencies are, what are the downstream dependencies for a system is. Because again, as I said in the beginning, workload is so wide as a terminology that
Mhm.
uh, what is end to end is sometimes very hard to describe. From an executive level, at a CTO level, it could be all the systems that are meeting the business objectives for themselves. But as you drill down and actually engage with the application teams or the support teams, they when you talk about a workload, they might be really talking about the area of jurisdiction from their perspective, the
Right.
things that they can control, right? But from UOps perspective, what we're trying to do is we are trying to map end-to-end dependencies for a workload, understand what are the features, what are the services that those individual dependencies are using. And then also, if you're using AWS partners, what is the reason we are trying to document is we were trying to understand, are there any risks if you're using any specific partner and maybe they don't have a DR strategy?
Mhm.
Um, I have also personally run into scenarios where the the customer was able to execute their failover, but they had no DR practice runs or the validation of the DR posture for their partner services. So that comes up a lot on our side, actually.
Okay. And so how do you, I guess, like triage those type of conversations? Does that kind of also falls into like how you document the runbooks going forward as part of like an external customer, I guess, like an end customer being the partner itself?
It's a conversation. The first step is to document. Once we are aligned that, okay, this is a dependency for the workload for which there is no workaround, then it's a discussion with the customer, right? You run that as a failure mode effects analysis scenario, and you say,
Mhm.
what if this API was down?
Mhm.
Would you still be able to run? Is your workload static stable, right? And if it's a hard dependency, what is the partner commitment for your workload? Can they recover in this enough time to meet your RPO RTO from a business perspective? So those are some of the areas. In some occasions, we have been able to spin up three-way DR tests where we not only are partnering with the DR with our customers, but they
Mhm.
also have been able to bring in their partner support teams onto the call, and we are able to run specific failure scenarios and see if there are any risks or not.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting because I feel like usually how we think about resiliency is just of what we can control immediate to us, and we don't really think about those other areas that might also impact and baked into the time that we are trying to recover. Never actually thought about it more in that space, so it's actually a pretty good point that you bring forward as well.
Yeah, and you can go like you should document everything here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've had discussions around internet traffic, how resilient it is. Are there any different options that are available to make the workload more resilient or not? So you can go in a lot of different ways, but this is a very good topic to
Mm-hmm.
discuss with our
Mm-hmm.
customers.
Yep, I agree.
The second piece is really, so this is the FMEA analysis that I was talking about. This is failure mode effects analysis. This is a
Okay.
industry standard. It is not a AWS specific capability, but it's a good discussion to have. A lot of the times when we go out to our customers and talk about chaos engineering, we miss this critical piece. Because in the end, we need to ensure that the failure modes that are possible for the workload, we are aligned on their probability.
Okay.
And then the high probability ones should be immediately tested. So what you see on here is a FMEA on an infrastructure layer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think 3 years back or 2 years back, I was in a conversation with one of the customers for FMEA, and we were discussing how an international security event could cause disruption to the financial institution. And there was a very specific example that was used. It was like, oh, what if there is a missile that's en route on towards the east coast of US, and then
Oh
how would
no.
we react, right?
Uh-huh.
And everybody was dead serious for like 5 minutes, and we were trying to say, okay, what should we have a multi-region? Should we have something else? And somebody in the room just raised their hand and said, If something of that sort was en route, trading would be the last thing we would be worried about,
Yeah, exactly. 100% agree
right?
with that statement.
So in the end, the probability column defines on which particular failure modes you should prioritize and then work backwards on testing your workload against it,
Okay.
right? Because in the end, you can spend millions of dollars in making your application resilient to that kind of a catastrophic event, but then the dividends are pretty low unless you are actually the top tier application for international finance systems, as an example, the example that I was taking.
Yeah, and then he also goes more into that what is it called, thought that you were talking about, like the continuous testing, right? You're seeing what is the highly more probable thing that could happen, but then you continue to work towards that and identify more probabilities as time goes by. So it's not something that you just sense once and kind of be like, okay, this is how we will handle it, but then it's just something that you continue to streamline across your workload as time continues to pass. So
Exactly. So we do this at a workload level. We document all these things. We figure out if so. Also, there's one important thing to clarify. We are not forcing our customers to redo some of the testing that they might already be doing.
mhm.
We are happy to ingest the testing that they have done and then provide our recommendations.
Okay. Okay.
The last pillar is observability. This is more of how the observability has been instrumented for the workload. At what level is it only done at infra level? Is it an application, as a business? Are we doing traces, logs, alarms? And then we have things like synthetics, business KPIs, right? So we try to bring all these together in a single place because a lot of the times when we work with our technical operators, they might not be tracking the business KPIs. So
Mhm.
it's good to for us to bring everything together at a workload level in one place, and then drive improvements accordingly.
Right, because it's giving the context and the use case of how this workload may impact you as a customer itself and an organization. We have discussed this before in our previous episodes as well. It's having the context and building knowledge about those specific workloads rather than coming back and having these discussions over and over again whenever you are actually experiencing an issue. It's more of like a work in progress and it continues to progress over time rather than having to come in and ask for AWS support and submit a support case to try to work through this issue and then you having to explain it all over again every single time you encounter an event.
Exactly. So we bring some of these pillars together in the findings and the recommendations section, and then depending upon which phase of the resilience lifecycle the workload is in, we try to partner with our customers to close some of the findings and observations. Um, and I know, Zamara, I did take up a lot of the time as part of this session. I will quickly go to our example, and then I can
And
hand
don't
it
worry
over to
about
you.
it. Take your time. We're totally good in time. Don't worry about the time. And then, we are talking about critical workload reviews as part of unified operations. If any of you at some point have any comments, any questions, or follow up for Shaz or myself, please feel free to drop those in the comments. We'll bring them forward, try them, address them as we see them. But just a reminder that you can always ask us anything and you don't have to wait for us to actually kind of ask for questions.
Perfect. So the example that you see on screen is, of course, a synthetic workload. This is something that I built on myself and my teammates built on Kiro.
Okay.
So we wanted a realistic example in ready for this session. But if you see here, like you could have a layered workload like this, which has a compute layer, you have the data layer, you have the serverless layer, and then you might have a DR set up
Hmm.
in the US West 2 region. Uh, but how do we go about? That's where the CWR template comes in because we break down some of these things in our templates and then go layer by layer. So what do I mean with that is, so this is a sample recommendations chart as part of CWR where we analyzed and said, oh, you are using EKS for your checkout service. You have a very specific EC2 instance that you use. You have 9 pods, 3 per AZ, and 27 pods for the peaks, right? But are there anything that you can do better? Like pre-scaling 2 hours before an event starts could be a very logical recommendation back to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Payment service, like payment latencies are typically very sensitive. You may need a circuit breaker that basically times out after 3 seconds if you run
Mm-hmm.
into an issue. Uh, CPU intensive, you could actually optimize locked retries. That's a good one. You might want to scale up to a different EC2 type. But if you think about it, these are the recommendations that are spread across our different services, but UOps kind of brings them together and
Mm-hmm.
dives deeper. Uh, in here, right? Like, for example, as part of the workload analysis, um, the example that I shared was actually dependent on the control plane for Route 53 to fail out. Uh, Typically, for very critical systems, we do recommend the customers to use Route 53 application recovery controller itself, so that they rely on the data plane instead of the control plane. Similarly, failure domain isolation, data replication. This is again mapping to some of the workload requirements, but these are the
Mm-hmm.
recommendations that are coming from our domain specialists themselves.
Okay.
Um, this was the key piece that we were talking in theory, but if you think about from an infrastructure perspective, what happens during an AZ failover for the Aurora database? What is the effect? What is the cause? What are the controls? What is the probability? What is the risk? So in the end, our goal is to share some of these failure modes with our customers, which may or may not be aware of, because yeah, our services do a fantastic job of staying up a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have to account for the failures again. Uh, but this is where we expect our customers to try out the recommendations or the testings for high probability failures at a bare minimum. And that's where we document some of these here in failure mode test cases. So it's a collaboration. So we talk to them about using fault injection service. We partner
Right.
with them
Mm-hmm.
to run these scenarios and figure out what the status is,
Okay.
right? And if there is a continuous anomaly on some of these findings, that's where we can partner and kind of resolve that. And that could mean diving deeper into a particular service, adding more features, and coming up with alternatives if we had to.
Yeah, I really like the fact that it actually has that fail, pass, and pending because that kind of gives you all like an inclusive view of exactly what needs to continue to be addressed. And then in those conversations where sometimes you give those recommendations, you go over the recommendations, but sometimes they're kind of like, yeah, that's something that we may overlook. But then when you're testing with them and you're actually seeing how the failures take place, it kind of takes like a bigger priority whenever you're having these discussions with the customer. Actually, we have a question. Borghetti says, can you link the slide? Are you referring to just like the information about unified operations as a whole, or which specific information, Borghetti? Maybe he's referring to is a sample assessment available to be shared, or is this just kind of like just for covering this information, Shaz?
This is something that I built for the session, so it's
Okay,
not a
okay.
public. It's just an example.
Yeah. The superior app resilient assessment. Yeah. So this is just a demo, one Borghetti, but this is just to kind of give you an example as a customer of what you would look forward to if you were to have a CWR. All right.
So this is a quick summary discussion with our customers, but these are the observations and the recommendations that we summarize as part of the discussion with our customers. And then we build a recovery plan, which is a typical follow-up to a CWR.
Right. Yeah, so it's pretty, I mean, it goes into pretty good detail about it, right? I think that one of I guess like the most common thing that we kind of discuss, and you also mentioned it before, is sometimes customers have, their infrastructure spread into two different regions, but in the two regions they're only using one availability zone, and then they're like, okay, well, that should be good enough for my DR, but then this is like the exact scenario that we don't want to happen. And so I would assume that something like that will be called out here as well, because when we mean multi-region, we also mean multi-AC as well. You don't want to be depending into just one AC for your DR strategy.
Always, because multi-AZ is should be your first milestone to have a resilient workload.
We have a question from Cesar. It says, how important is compliance as PII, for example, with regulations within your workflow when resolving a particular customer issue?
It's the foremost thing. PII is very important for us. Um, that's why you have this account team as part of UOps to
Mhm.
retain that context and ensure that this is not something that is being plastered everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is just with the individuals that you work internally as part of your account team, as part of the SMEs that come and have those conversations with you. This is something that if there is any PII data or something like that, all that takes into the accounts, into the recommendations and the services that you should be using from the AWS side as well.
Okay, Zamara, I think it'll be a good point, good moment to pivot to a real example on how you could do it outside of UOps as well.
Yes, of course. So actually, as part of today's discussion, and then I'll take your screen out, we did kind of want to go through the motions of like, we have just covered what you will have as part of UOps. But if you don't have UOps right now, or you don't have, a way of right now of testing your workload, of testing how everything is working within your application itself, we have covered before the Resiliency Hub or AWS Resiliency Hub, which is a way that you can assess where your workloads are, how it's currently architected, and then identify those recommendations as to how you can improve it and work over time to meet those RTO, RPO, and the different ways of how you want to move forward when you're talking about your resiliency posture and the strategy going forward. So let me start sharing my screen. And I think that our team already share the Resiliency Hub right here. Okay. Yes, I see it being pushed out. Thank you. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open my environment. Just give me 1 second. All right. So I am in the console, and then everybody should be able to see my screen now. So as we go, we will look for the Resiliency Hub. And when we navigate here, you have a place where you have your applications, and just how Shaz was talking about how we document as part of CWR the application and the different objectives that you have. You have the option to do that as well here through the console itself. So for now, I want to focus on one that I already have here deployed or already there. So if we look at the summary of this specific ARD production workload or application details, we see that the resiliency policy is ARD single region. It gives you the application structure, which gives you the different resources. We see that we have a bucket, that we have a DB instance, we have an EC2 instance, and then just how everything right now, the status is accessible. So what we want to do is also review the policies, which we kind of touch upon there as part of the CWR as well, where this is pretty much where you have your customer application, and then you define what those applications RTO and RPO is. For this specific one, the customer application RTO and RPO the RTO is 2 hours, the RPO is 5 minutes. And then we have the cloud infrastructure RTO and RPO to be 5 minutes and 5 minutes each for the infrastructure and the availability zone. So that's the information that we have for this particular one. So now we go back to the application, we click on this one, and I want to make sure that we go and do the assessment of how this application is right now. So to do that, I first want to make sure that we enable drift notifications as well, because we want to make sure that we get any notifications of any drifts that have come or that are as part of this review. And then also choose my SNS topic, which I already have set. So I'll enable that. And then what I will do now is go ahead and click on my version and then click Assess Application. So that will run and it take a bit of time to kind of go ahead and see what recommendations or what finding it finds. I feel like it's a pretty straightforward process. It doesn't go as into that much detail as we went in the CWR when you're actually going through this whole process with SMEs and an account team, but this is a way that you can do it yourself and then find those gaps as well. So as you can see, it has finished, and then now we have the compliance status, and it says policy breach, which means that it did not meet our expectations of how we completed our customer application RTO and RPO, the same for infrastructure and availability zone. So we can actually go through the different findings and see that the estimated workload RTO is unrecoverable, and then the RPO as well as unrecoverable. It does tell you if in a specific resource that's needed, which like in this case, the EC2 instance was 35 minutes. So that meets the under 2 hour threshold that we put together. But then when we look at the cloud infrastructure RTO and RPO, we do see that it's breached. When we click it, then it tells us why. So we see that the stateless Amazon EC2 instance is identified. The estimated workload RTO indicates that the time to deploy a new instance and reprovision it to the workload resources in the event of a disruption. So the EC2 initiation time of a new instance can vary according to availability of the selected instance type in the target availability zone. And I feel like this is something that we discuss a lot too as well, Shaz. Sometimes customers only want to use one specific type of EC2 instance to run their workloads, and they don't really have a variation or try to diversify their pool of type of instances that they can use. And it's a continuous conversation that we have, especially when they're only using one availability zone. Wonder if that has ever come into play whenever you're having these
It's
discussions with the customer.
it's actually always, right? Like you can find a EC2 which meets your needs, but you should always have backup instance types ready to go. Let's say if you don't want to pay for capacity reservations, it's capacity on demand, and it's literally on demand. If we have other customers who are really want to take that particular EC2 type and you can't find any when you need it, especially at the time of scaling, you should have backup EC2s configured as part of your auto scaling groups for sure.
I 100% agree on that. Then we can see that in the availability zone, we also have 3 policy breaches. If we go over it in the findings, we also see the same thing for the EC2 instances, and then as well as one for the DB instance or the database instance. No AWS backup plan, RDS automatic backup or read replica identified for Amazon RDS instance, no recovery option in the event of an infrastructure or availability zone disruption. So this also goes into details into what you should take into account whenever you are actually building your resiliency plan and strategy going forward. I feel that it gives you a good start start a basis to start a conversation on how you can improve it. It gives you those immediate findings of like, this is what you should be looking at, and this is how you should be structuring those conversations going forward as you continue to build the resiliency strategy itself.
Yeah, and it's also about testing, right, Zamara? I think more these
Mhm.
workloads are tested, that's a painful way to get these insights, and this is painless way of getting those insights before
Right.
you test.
Exactly. And then that's always what we say, right? Even with that, and we're gonna deep dive into, we do get the resiliency recommendations, which is similar to what the assessment area of the CWR that was covered by Shaz. Like, it does give you the different options of how you can make the changes, and the different options of how you can um, create those, and it actually gives you, I guess, like a base cost of what that would look like. But it also, in a way, updates those run books into how you're looking at your posture now, and into how you want to work up and to make sure that you have high availability. Also, you have the option to only apply certain changes. Given that you test, we always tell people, please don't just go ahead and deploy changes into straight into a production workload. Even as minimal as updating a quick site dashboard, you should have a testing session before you do that, because then you might be disrupting the use of that specific area for your whole entire organization, or whatever team that consumes that information out of just, let's say, something as simple as one dashboard. Now imagine if you actually push changes into a production workload itself. It would not be the greatest scenario to have.
I think the key point there is make sure it's CI/CD.
We don't want you doing that type of stuff. So in here, you can actually, like I said, go ahead and look at the different recommendations, the different changes. For example, something like add versioning to your S3 bucket to enable job recovery in an event of unexpected changes, or deletion by retaining the previous version of the object. So it's very meticulous in explaining exactly why you will need it and how it can improve your availability of a specific aspect of your application itself. So you can go ahead and actually apply those recommendations. If you go back to um, the applications, if you go here, you can actually review the recommendations, and then actually go through the overview of what those recommendations are, the different alarms also that are recommended. One of the things that we discussed a lot in today's episode is observability, and then continuous observability over time of the different areas of your application. So you can definitely also look at how to do those specifically. So we have 2 minutes left, so I just wanted to kind of recap what our conversation is today. One thing that I wanted to kind of showcase here as well today, but we didn't have the time, was to do a quick FIS, or fault injection service experiment, to kind of showcase how you can also test that environment against those recommendations and implementations that you take as you continues to grow your resiliency strategy. I guess that would be a good opportunity to bring you back sometime, Shaz. But for today, I think that we have given our audience I guess, overview of how we're talking to our customers about resiliency, and then you, from the user side of AWS, of how you should be viewing this I guess, resiliency topic, and not just a one-time thing that you should revise or make a run book for, but a continuous conversation to have going forward. Not just you yourself looking at the application that you currently have deployed, but also those ones that are already in production and you want to continue to maintain in high availability. Any parting words, Shaz? Any best practices or words of wisdom that you want to share with the audience before we end today's stream?
No, keep testing. Happy building.
Thank you so much, Chaz, for being with us today. Borghetti says, thank you guys. So many interesting topic. Thank you for joining. I hope that everybody has a great rest of your week. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.